Venetian and Genoese fleets provide not only transportation, but also specialized siege equipment designed specifically for amphibious operations. The famous chain tower that guards Damietta's harbour becomes the focus of a complex engineering challenge that results in the construction of floating siege engines and the development of new techniques for conducting warfare in riverine environments. The successful capture of Damietta in November 1219 represents a significant military achievement, but it also reveals the continuing political divisions that plague crusading expeditions. The papal legate Pelagius, armed with extensive authority from Rome, clashes repeatedly with secular leaders over strategy and objectives. King John of Brienne, nominal ruler of Jerusalem, advocates for a cautious approach that would consolidate Christian control over the Nile Delta before attempting further advances. Pelagius, convinced that divine providence has destined the expedition for complete victory, insists on an immediate advance toward Cairo. The advance up the Nile in July 1221 becomes a disaster that rivals the worst defeats in crusading history. Al-Kamil's strategic flooding of the Nile Delta traps the Christian army in a landscape transformed into an impassable marsh. The technological superiority that enabled the capture of Damietta becomes irrelevant in an environment where heavy cavalry cannot operate and supply lines cannot be maintained. The expedition's surrender and withdrawal represent not merely a military defeat, but a fundamental challenge to the theological assumptions that have sustained the crusading movement. The failure of the Fifth Crusade catalyzes a remarkable diplomatic revolution that will reshape the entire context of Christian engagement with the Islamic world. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, inherits not only the crusading vow of his predecessor, but also a unique perspective on Christian-Islamic relations shaped by his rule over Sicily's multi-religious population. Frederick's court in Palermo includes Muslim scholars, Jewish physicians, and Christian theologians who collaborate in an atmosphere of intellectual exchange that would be impossible in most European centres. Frederick's approach to the Crusade reflects this cosmopolitan background. Rather than viewing the expedition as a religious war between incompatible civilizations, he treats it as a complex diplomatic challenge that can be resolved through negotiation among sophisticated political actors who happen to adhere to different religious traditions. His correspondence with Al-Kamil reveals two rulers who share similar interests in philosophy, mathematics, and political theory, and who view their religious differences as obstacles to be overcome rather than fundamental barriers to cooperation. The negotiations that culminate in the Treaty of Jaffa in February 1229 represent perhaps the most sophisticated diplomatic achievement in the entire history of the Crusades. The agreement grants Christians control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, along with a corridor connecting these holy sites to the coast at Acre. Muslims retain control over the Temple Mount, with its sacred dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, while Christians regain access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sites associated with the life of Jesus. The treaty's innovative approach to religious coexistence establishes principles that prefigure modern concepts of religious freedom and minority rights. Christians and Muslims are guaranteed the right to worship freely in areas controlled by the other faith, while merchants and pilgrims from both communities receive protection and trading privileges throughout the region. The agreement even includes provisions for joint administration of disputed sites and mechanisms for resolving conflicts through arbitration rather than warfare. Frederick's bloodless recovery of Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than conquest represents a fundamental challenge to the military culture that has dominated the crusading movement for over a century. The emperor's coronation as King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, performed by his own hands in the absence of any clergy willing to participate in the ceremony, symbolizes both the achievement and the isolation that his unorthodox methods have created. The reaction to Frederick's diplomatic triumph reveals the deep tensions within Latin Christendom over the proper relationship between religious conviction and political pragmatism. Pope Gregory IX, locked in a broader conflict with Frederick over imperial authority in Italy, denounces the treaty as an unacceptable compromise with infidel power. The Patriarch of Jerusalem places the city under interdict, arguing that a Jerusalem controlled through negotiation with Muslims cannot be considered truly liberated. Many of the military orders view Frederick's success with suspicion, recognizing that his diplomatic methods threaten their institutional raison d'être. Yet Frederick's achievement also demonstrates possibilities for Christian-Islamic coexistence that inspire new approaches to interfaith dialogue throughout the Mediterranean world. The Treaty of Jaffa becomes a model for subsequent agreements between Christian and Muslim rulers, establishing precedents for religious tolerance and commercial cooperation that will influence diplomatic practice for centuries to come. The emperor's court in Sicily continues to serve as a center for cross-cultural exchange, where Islamic scientific texts are translated into Latin and Christian theological works are rendered into Arabic. The intellectual ferment generated by this cultural exchange contributes to the remarkable flowering of medieval philosophy and science in the 13th century. The works of Averroes and Avicenna, transmitted through Sicilian and Spanish translation centers, profoundly influence Christian thinkers like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. The Aristotelian revival that transforms European universities begins with Islamic commentaries that preserve and extend Greek philosophical traditions. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that enables the development of Gothic architecture and improved navigation techniques derives largely from Islamic sources transmitted through these cross-cultural networks. Yet, even as diplomatic and intellectual exchange creates new possibilities for Christian-Islamic understanding, the fundamental military challenge posed by Islamic resurgence continues to evolve. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt represents a new phase in the long struggle for dominance over the Eastern Mediterranean. Unlike the Ayyubid princes, who were often willing to negotiate with Christian rulers as equals, the Mamluk military elite views the Crusader states as anachronistic vestiges of an earlier era that must be systematically eliminated. The Mamluk military system represents a revolutionary approach to warfare that combines the traditional strengths of Islamic cavalry with new technologies and organizational methods borrowed from their conflicts with the Mongols. The Mamluk warrior, trained from childhood in specialized military academies, represents a new type of professional soldier whose skills surpass those of both the feudal levies and the military orders that form the backbone of Christian resistance. The Mamluk composite bow, capable of penetrating the heaviest European armor at ranges that Western crossbows cannot match, gives Islamic forces a decisive technological advantage in siege warfare. The systematic Mamluk conquest of the Crusader states begins with the capture of Antioch in 1268, a siege that demonstrates the new level of military sophistication that Islamic forces have achieved. The city's massive fortifications, which had withstood numerous previous sieges, crumble before the concentrated fire of Mamluk mangonels and trebuchets, operated by engineers trained in the latest Chinese and Persian siege techniques. The fall of Antioch, one of the first and greatest Crusader conquests, sends shockwaves throughout Latin Christendom and marks the beginning of the end for the Latin presence in the Levant. Sultan Baybars, the Mamluk leader who orchestrates this final phase of Islamic reconquest, represents a new type of Islamic leader whose methods combine traditional Ghazi warfare with sophisticated intelligence networks and psychological warfare. Baybars' use of carrier pigeons to coordinate military operations across vast distances gives his forces unprecedented strategic mobility, while his network of spies and informants within the Crusader states provides detailed intelligence about Christian military preparations and political divisions. The systematic nature of Mamluk conquest reflects a strategic vision that seeks not merely to defeat Christian armies in battle, but to eliminate the entire infrastructure that has sustained the Latin presence in the East. Captured fortifications are not merely garrisoned, but systematically demolished to prevent future Christian attempts at reconquest. Christian populations are not simply subjugated, but often deported or eliminated entirely to prevent the emergence of fifth columns that might assist future crusading expeditions. The Mamluk approach to conquest represents total war in a sense that earlier Islamic leaders had rarely contemplated. The siege of Acre in 1291 becomes the final act in this drama of systematic elimination. The city's massive fortifications, strengthened and expanded over 2 centuries of continuous conflict, represent the pinnacle of medieval military engineering. The harbour installations that have made Acre the commercial heart of the Crusader states rival those of Venice and Constantinople in their sophistication. The city's cosmopolitan population includes not only Latin Christians, but also Eastern Orthodox believers, Armenians, Syrians, and even Muslim merchants who have prospered under the relatively tolerant administration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Mamluk siege of Acre employs every technique of medieval warfare developed over 2 centuries of Christian-Islamic conflict. Massive siege engines hurl stone projectiles weighing over 300 pounds against the city's walls, while miners tunnel beneath the fortifications to undermine their foundations. The city's harbour is blockaded by a Mamluk fleet that prevents any possibility of relief or evacuation by sea. For the first time in the history of the Crusades, Islamic forces possess clear superiority in both technology and resources, making the outcome of the siege a foregone conclusion. The fall of Acre on May 18, 1291, marks not merely the end of a particular military campaign, but the conclusion of nearly 2 centuries of Latin political presence in the Levant. The systematic destruction of the city's fortifications and the elimination of its Christian population ensure that no future expedition will find any infrastructure on which to build a renewed Crusader presence. The Mamluk policy of creating what modern strategists would call a defensive desert along the Palestinian coast reflects a sophisticated understanding of the strategic requirements for preventing future Christian conquest attempts. The news of Acre's fall reaches Europe at a time when the political and social foundations of the crusading movement have already been fundamentally transformed. The rise of centralized monarchies in France and England has shifted the balance of power away from the feudal nobility who provided the military backbone of earlier expeditions. The development of professional armies equipped with new weapons like the crossbow and the longbow has made the heavy cavalry charge, the traditional tactical foundation of crusading warfare, increasingly obsolete. More fundamentally, the intellectual and spiritual climate of late 13th century Europe has evolved in ways that make the simple certainties of earlier crusading propaganda difficult to sustain. The translation of Islamic philosophical and scientific works has created a more sophisticated understanding of Islamic civilization among European intellectuals. The growth of universities and the development of scholastic theology have produced new approaches to Christian-Islamic dialogue that emphasize rational argument over military conquest. The response to Acre's fall reveals these deeper transformations in European consciousness. While traditional calls for new expeditions continue to emanate from the papal court, they generate little of the popular enthusiasm that had characterized earlier crusading preaching. The French monarchy, now the dominant power in Western Europe, shows more interest in consolidating its control over southern France and expanding into the Low Countries than in expensive Eastern Mediterranean adventures. The English are absorbed in their ongoing conflicts with Scotland and Wales, while the German princes remain divided among themselves and focused on local concerns. Perhaps most significantly, new forms of Christian spirituality have emerged that offer alternatives to the military ideology that had sustained the crusading movement. The mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, emphasize poverty, preaching, and peaceful conversion over armed conquest. The mystical traditions associated with figures like Meister Eckhart and the Rhineland mystics stress inner spiritual transformation rather than external military achievement. The growing influence of female religious figures like Mechtild of Magdeburg and Marguerite Porete suggests new approaches to religious experience that transcend the masculine military culture of traditional crusading spirituality. Yet even as the military phase of the crusading movement draws to a close, its intellectual and cultural legacy continues to shape European development in profound ways. The maritime technologies developed for crusading expeditions contribute to the expansion of European trade networks that will eventually span the globe. The organizational methods pioneered by the military orders influence the development of banking, agriculture, and urban administration throughout Europe. The legal concepts developed for governing multi-religious societies in the Crusader states provide precedents for addressing religious diversity in European kingdoms. Most importantly, the encounter with Islamic civilization has fundamentally expanded European intellectual horizons in ways that will prove decisive for future cultural development. The Aristotelian philosophy transmitted through Islamic sources becomes the foundation for scholastic theology and the university system. Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge enables the navigation techniques that will make possible the age of exploration. Islamic medical knowledge, preserved and extended in centers like Cordoba and Baghdad, revolutionizes European medical practice and contributes to the demographic expansion that characterizes the High Middle Ages. The artistic and architectural legacy of the Crusades proves equally transformative. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and other structural innovations developed in Islamic architecture influence the emergence of the Gothic style that will transform European cathedral building. The decorative techniques and geometric patterns encountered in Islamic art contribute to the development of new aesthetic approaches in European manuscript illumination and metalwork. Even the literary traditions of medieval Europe show profound Islamic influence. From the courtly romance cycles that incorporate Oriental themes to the philosophical allegories that reflect Islamic narrative techniques. As the 14th century dawns, the word crusade itself begins to acquire new meanings that extend far beyond its original military context. Papal efforts to organize expeditions for the recovery of the Holy Land continue throughout the century, but they increasingly serve as diplomatic and financial instruments rather than serious military enterprises. The crusading ideal becomes attached to other conflicts, the Reconquista in Iberia, the wars against pagans in the Baltic, the struggle against Ottoman expansion in the Balkans, that have their own distinct characteristics and motivations. The transformation of crusading from a specific historical movement into a more general cultural metaphor reflects the profound changes that 2 centuries of Eastern Mediterranean warfare have wrought in European consciousness. The simple binary opposition between Christian and Muslim, believer and infidel, that had sustained the original crusading ideology has given way to a more complex understanding of religious and cultural difference. The encounter with Islamic civilization has revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of religious warfare as an instrument of cultural transformation. In the monasteries and universities of 14th century Europe, scholars begin the long process of interpreting and reinterpreting the crusading experience for new generations, who will face very different challenges. The historical chronicles that preserve the memory of these expeditions become sources not only for understanding the past, but for imagining alternative futures. The theological treatises that attempted to justify or criticize crusading warfare contribute to evolving theories of just war and international law. The literary works that romanticize or critique the crusading ideal help to shape new forms of cultural expression that will characterize the late medieval and early modern periods. Perhaps most significantly, the crusading experience has demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of religious enthusiasm as a force for historical change. The extraordinary achievements of the First Crusade, the sophisticated political arrangements of the Crusade estates, and the remarkable cultural exchange that characterized 2 centuries of Christian-Islamic encounter all testify to the creative potential that can be unleashed when religious conviction is channeled through effective institutional structures. Yet the ultimate failure of the crusading project to achieve its stated objectives also reveals the dangers inherent in any attempt to impose religious solutions on complex political problems. The repeated cycles of conquest and reconquest, the enormous human costs of 2 centuries of warfare, and the persistent inability of military success to generate lasting political stability all suggest the limitations of force as an instrument of religious or cultural transformation. As the medieval period gradually gives way to the early modern era, the crusading legacy will continue to influence European development in ways both obvious and subtle. The maritime expansion that carries European power to the Americas and Asia draws heavily on technologies and organizational methods pioneered during the Eastern Mediterranean expeditions. The colonial enterprises that establish European dominance over much of the non-European world often employ ideological justifications that echo crusading themes of religious mission and cultural superiority. Yet the same period also witnesses the development of new approaches to religious and cultural diversity that reflect lessons learned from the crusading experience. The concept of religious tolerance, the principles of international law, and the ideals of cultural exchange that will characterize the Enlightenment all have roots in the complex interactions between Christian and Islamic civilizations during the medieval period. The story of the Crusades thus represents more than simply a chapter in medieval military history. It constitutes a foundational experience in the long process by which European civilization defined itself in relation to the wider world. The encounter with Islamic civilization that these expeditions initiated continues to shape global politics and culture in ways that would have been unimaginable to the warriors who first answered Urban II's call at Clermont. As we trace the final transformation of crusading idealism into the more complex realities of late medieval politics and culture, we can see reflected in this transformation the broader patterns that have characterized human civilization throughout history. The tension between religious conviction and political pragmatism, the challenge of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances, and the eternal human struggle to balance idealism with realism. All of these universal themes find expression in the particular story of the Crusades. The silence that finally settles over the battlefields of the Levant is thus not the silence of ending, but of transformation. The dreams and nightmares, the triumphs and tragedies, the hopes and fears that motivated 2 centuries of crusading warfare have not disappeared, but have been absorbed into the larger stream of human experience. They continue to flow beneath the surface of subsequent history, sometimes emerging in new forms, sometimes remaining hidden, but always present as part of the vast accumulation of human memory and aspiration that connects each generation to those that have gone before. In this way, the Crusades become not merely a historical phenomenon to be studied and understood, but a continuing part of the human story that each generation must interpret anew for itself. the questions that the Crusaders faced about the relationship between faith and violence, about the possibilities and limitations of cultural encounter, about the meaning of religious commitment in a complex world, remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago. The answers that each generation provides to these questions will determine not only how the crusading legacy is remembered, but how its deeper insights contribute to the ongoing human quest for meaning, justice, and peace. The son of Palus had finally returned to the field of battle, terrible in his divine armor and burning with a desire for vengeance. Yet even as his bronze spear drank deeply of Trojan blood, the war itself had begun to evolve beyond the comprehension of mortal heroes. For 9 long years, this conflict had been fought according to ancient rules. Champions met in single combat while armies watched. Gods intervened openly on behalf of their favorites. Honor and glory meant more than strategic advantage. But the slaughter unleashed by Achilles' wrath marked the beginning of something different. A new kind of warfare, where divine fury and mortal technology combined to create destruction on an unprecedented scale. The first sign of this transformation came not from the Greek camp, but from the very walls of Troy itself. As Hector's funeral fires burned low and his ashes were gathered in their golden urn, the city's defenders knew that conventional tactics could no longer protect them from the terror that prowled outside their gates. The son of Palus had become something more than human, less than God, a force of nature that could not be turned aside by bronze spears or noble courage. In the councils of Troy, voices began to whisper of desperate measures. Some spoke of magical weapons hidden in the deepest vaults of Priam's palace, artifacts from the age when gods walked openly among men. Others suggested appealing to powers beyond Olympus, to the primordial forces that had existed before Zeus claimed his throne. But Priam, aged and broken by his son's death, could only weep and speak of his remaining children, who would soon follow Hector to the house of Hades. Meanwhile, the Greek camp buzzed with fresh hope. The return of their greatest warrior had shifted the entire dynamic of the siege. Where once they had been content to raid and plunder, now they spoke openly of storming Troy's walls and putting the city to the torch. The sight of Achilles in his divine armor, terrible as the god of war himself, had reminded them why they had crossed the wine-dark sea in the first place. But the war's evolution was perhaps most visible in the way it now consumed everything in its path. The countryside around Troy, once dotted with prosperous farms and thriving villages, had become a wasteland of ash and bone. The sacred groves where shepherds once made offerings to the gods had been stripped bare for funeral pyres. Even the great river Scamander, defiled by Achilles' slaughter, ran red with blood and choked with corpses. This was no longer the heroic conflict that poets would sing about in golden halls. It had become something darker, more primal, a war that threatened to devour not just the combatants, but the very principles of civilization itself. The careful balance between divine intervention and mortal agency that had governed conflicts since the Age of Heroes was cracking under the weight of accumulated hatred and divine wrath. The gods themselves seemed to sense this change. On Olympus, the easy confidence that had marked their earlier interventions gave way to something approaching concern. Zeus, who had once been content to watch mortals play out their eternal dramas of love and hate, now found himself weighing consequences that might extend far beyond the walls of Troy. The war that had begun with a golden apple and a judgment clouded by desire was threatening to become something that could reshape the relationship between heaven and earth forever. In the Trojan palace, Queen Hecuba worked her loom with trembling fingers, weaving patterns that seemed to shift and change before her eyes. Some said the gods had touched her with the gift of prophecy, that she could see in her threads the fates of all her children yet to fall. Others whispered that grief had simply driven her mad, that she wove shrouds for sons still living, because she could no longer distinguish between past and future in her sorrow. Prince Paris, the beautiful shepherd who had started this war with his theft of Helen, now walked the walls of Troy like a man haunted by ghosts. The confident youth who had once believed that Aphrodite's favor could shield him from all consequences had aged years in the span of days since his brother's death. He still carried his silver bow, still commanded the respect due to a son of Priam, but something essential had died in him when he saw Hector's corpse dragged behind Achilles' chariot. Even Helen herself, the face that had launched 1,000 ships, seemed diminished by the weight of what her beauty had wrought. She spent her days in the highest tower of the palace, gazing out over the battlefield where men died daily for her sake. Some said she was weaving a great tapestry that depicted all the struggles fought in her name, as if by capturing them in thread and dye, she could somehow make sense of the destruction that followed in her wake. The common soldiers on both sides felt this change most acutely. Veterans who had fought for 9 years spoke in hushed tones of how different this war had become. Where once there had been rules, unspoken but understood by all, now there seemed to be only the logic of escalation. Each act of brutality demanded a response in kind. Each violation of custom made the next transgression easier to justify. Young warriors who had grown to manhood during the siege knew no other reality than this. They had learned to fight not for glory or honor, but for survival in a world where mercy was weakness and hesitation meant death. They watched Achilles drag Hector's corpse around Troy's walls and saw not an abomination that violated every principle of civilized warfare, but simply the natural progression of a conflict that had long since abandoned such niceties. The priests in both camps struggled to make sense of divine will in this new reality. How could the gods, who had once seemed to follow comprehensible patterns of favor and disfavor, now permit such chaos to reign? Some began to whisper that the war had somehow broken free of divine control, that mortal hatred had grown so intense it could override even the will of Zeus himself. But perhaps the most disturbing change was in the nature of heroism itself. The old ideal of the noble warrior, who fought with honor and treated his enemies with respect, seemed increasingly obsolete. Achilles, the greatest hero of his age, had become something that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. A figure of pure vengeance, beautiful and terrible, who acknowledged no law save his own grief. This transformation was most visible in how he treated not just his enemies, but his own comrades. Where once he had been content to sulk in his tent when his honor was slighted, now he seemed to burn with a fire that consumed everything around him. His fellow Greeks found themselves both awed and terrified by their greatest champion, never knowing whether his divine wrath might turn against them if they somehow displeased him. The weapons themselves seemed to be evolving as well. The simple bronze spears and swords that had equipped warriors since the Age of Heroes now shared the battlefield with more exotic implements of war. Arrows tipped with poisons that could kill with a scratch. Chariots fitted with scythed wheels that could mow down infantry like wheat. Siege engines capable of hurling massive stones over the highest walls. Some whispered that the gods themselves were providing these innovations, as if the immortals had grown bored with the stately pace of traditional warfare and sought to accelerate the conflict toward its inevitable conclusion. Others suggested that mortal ingenuity, sharpened by 9 years of desperate struggle, was simply discovering new ways to kill more efficiently. The very landscape around Troy bore witness to this evolution. What had once been a pastoral region of rolling hills and fertile valleys had been transformed into something resembling the antechamber of Hades itself. The earth was scarred with trenches and ramparts. The air hung thick with the smoke of constant funeral pyres. Even the weather seemed affected, as if the gods themselves were mourning the corruption of what had once been their favourite entertainment. Yet for all these changes, certain eternal truths remained. Men still died far from home, calling out for their mothers in their final moments. Women still wept for husbands and sons who would never return. Children still played at being warriors, not understanding that the real thing had become something far darker than their innocent games could capture. The war that had begun as a matter of honour, a wronged husband seeking justice for his stolen wife, had become something that consumed honour itself. The careful distinctions between right and wrong, between civilization and barbarism, between human and divine, were being ground down like grain between millstones. What would emerge from this process, none could say. As the moon set over the wine-dark sea and dawn approached with its promise of fresh violence, both armies prepared for another day of slaughter. But they were no longer quite the same forces that had faced each other across these blood-soaked plains for 9 long years. They had been changed by the war itself, shaped by forces that none of them fully understood. The conflict that had begun with gods and heroes was evolving into something that would require new words to describe, new stories to contain its meaning. The age of clear distinctions between divine and mortal, between civilization and chaos, between honor and survival, was ending. What was being born in its place would reshape not just the outcome of this particular war, but the very nature of warfare itself. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang its ancient song of sorrow, its voice a fragile thread of beauty in a world increasingly defined by its absence. Tomorrow would bring fresh heroes to the fore, new acts of courage and cruelty, and perhaps the beginning of the end for one side or the other. But tonight, in the brief space between one day's bloodshed and the next, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very elements sensed that something fundamental was shifting in the balance of the world. The Trojan War was no longer just a war. It was becoming something else entirely, a transformation that would echo through the ages, changing not just how men fought, but how they understood the very nature of heroism, honor, and the price of glory. The old songs would soon be inadequate to capture what was emerging from the ashes of the familiar world. And in his tent beside the black ships, Achilles polished his divine armor and dreamed of the death that awaited him, knowing that his choice had set in motion forces that would outlive them all. The year 1187 stands like a shadow across the landscape of medieval history. 3 decades have passed since the Second Crusade collapsed in humiliating failure before the walls of Damascus. The Crusader states that once seemed destined to expand across the entire Levant now cling precariously to a narrow strip of coastal territory. In Jerusalem, the leper king Baldwin IV has died, leaving behind a fractured succession and a kingdom torn by civil war. The unity that once made the Franks formidable has dissolved into bitter factionalism, with the native-born nobility, the Poulains, increasingly at odds with newly arrived Europeans, who understand neither the land nor its people. Into this vacuum steps a figure who will reshape the entire character of the Holy Wars. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, has spent the past decade methodically uniting the fractured Muslim world under his banner. Unlike his predecessors, who ruled through fear and divided their enemies through careful diplomacy, Saladin offers something far more dangerous, a vision of unified Islamic resistance blessed by religious authority and backed by military genius. The Sultan's rise began not in the glittering courts of Baghdad or Cairo, but in the harsh Kurdish mountains of northern Mesopotamia. Born into a family of military administrators serving the Zengid dynasty, he learned statecraft in the shadow of his uncle Shirkuh, a general whose campaigns in Egypt would reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. When Shirkuh died suddenly in Cairo in 1169, the young Saladin found himself thrust into leadership of a foreign army in a hostile land, surrounded by enemies who viewed him as an upstart Kurdish adventurer with neither legitimacy nor prospects for survival. But Saladin possessed qualities that his contemporaries fatally underestimated. Where other military commanders relied on brutality to maintain control, he combined genuine piety with calculated mercy, winning over populations that had suffered under harsh Fatimid rule, where previous conquerors had been content to extract tribute and move on. He methodically built administrative systems that could transform military victory into lasting political control. Most crucially, where his rivals saw the Crusader states as obstacles to their regional ambitions, Saladin recognized them as a unifying force that could rally all Islam under a single banner. The conquest of Egypt provided him with resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary ruler. The Nile's annual flood generated agricultural wealth that could fund armies and build fortifications. The trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean brought customs revenues that filled treasury vaults. The religious prestige of Cairo, with its great mosque university of Al-Azhar, offered a platform for presenting himself not merely as another warlord, but as the champion of orthodox Sunni Islam against both Shia heretics and Christian invaders. Yet even these advantages might have proved insufficient against the combined strength of the Crusader states and their Byzantine and Armenian allies, had not the Franks themselves provided Saladin with the opportunity he needed. The death of Baldwin IV in 1185 triggered a succession crisis that revealed just how fragile the Latin kingdom had become. The crown passed to his nephew, the child Baldwin V, under the regency of Raymond of Tripoli, a statesman who understood that survival required accommodation with Muslim neighbours. But when the boy king died after barely a year, the throne was seized by Guy of Lusignan, whose wife Sibylla gave him a claim through marriage, but whose character inspired neither respect nor confidence. Guy's elevation split the kingdom between supporters of the established succession and nobles who backed the rival claim of Humphrey of Torron, husband of Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister. This division might have remained a manageable political dispute, but it became a military crisis when Reynald of Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, launched unauthorized raids against Muslim caravans crossing his territory. Reynald was precisely the kind of crusader that contemporary chroniclers love to describe. Brave to the point of recklessness, proud to the point of arrogance, and utterly indifferent to the political consequences of his actions. His attacks on Muslim merchants and pilgrims provided Saladin with the perfect justification for war. Islamic law demanded that rulers protect believers travelling under safe conduct, and Reynald's violations of truces made him not merely an enemy, but an oath-breaker whose actions dishonoured the very concept of negotiated agreements. When diplomatic protests failed to secure either compensation for losses or guarantees against future attacks, Saladin declared jihad against the Crusader states, calling upon all Muslims to unite in a holy war that would cleanse the land of infidel occupation. The army that assembled under his banners in 1187 represented the largest Muslim force ever gathered against the Crusader states. Contingents arrived from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond, drawn by the promise of religious merit and material reward. But numbers alone had never been sufficient to defeat the Franks, whose heavy cavalry remained the most formidable military force in the medieval world. Saladin's genius lay in recognizing that victory required not just military superiority, but strategic insight that could turn the Crusaders' strengths into weaknesses. The The campaign began with a calculated provocation. While the main Muslim army besieged Tiberias, the capital of Raymond of Tripoli's principality, Saladin detached a strong force to ravage the countryside around the city. The garrison, commanded by Raymond's wife Esquiva, found itself cut off from relief and facing inevitable starvation unless help arrived quickly. The situation created exactly the dilemma that Saladin had intended. The Crusader army must either march to relieve Tiberias, abandoning its defensive positions for a risky advance across hostile territory, or watch one of their major fortresses fall without offering resistance. King Guy summoned his vassals to muster at Sephoria, a strong position with reliable water supplies and good defensive terrain. Here the Christian army could wait for Saladin to attack prepared positions, forcing the Muslims to assault uphill against heavy cavalry supported by infantry and crossbowmen. Raymond of Tripoli, despite his personal stake in Tiberias, argued passionately for remaining at Sephoria. He understood better than most how Muslim armies operated, having spent years as Saladin's prisoner and learning to respect his captor's strategic acumen. "Tiberias is my city, and my wife is inside," he reportedly declared. "But better that it should be lost than that we should all be destroyed." But Guy faced pressures that made defensive strategy politically impossible. The military orders, whose Grand Masters commanded contingents of elite warrior monks, argued that abandoning Tiberias without a fight would appear cowardly and invite further Muslim aggression. Newly arrived crusaders from Europe, unfamiliar with local conditions but eager for glory, dismissed Raymond's warnings as the counsel of fear. Most persuasively, Gerard of Riedefort, Grand Master of the Templars, accused the king of cowardice and suggested that those who advocated defensive tactics were secretly in league with the Muslims. The final decision came after a night of agonized deliberation. Guy, perhaps hoping to silence his critics through decisive action, perhaps genuinely believing that Christian valor could overcome any obstacle, ordered the army to march for Tiberias at dawn. The force that departed Sephoria on July 3, 1187, represented virtually the entire military strength of the Crusader states. Perhaps 20,000 men, including 200 heavy cavalry, the core of Frankish military power. It was the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land, but it was also the last army the kingdom could field. If this force were destroyed, no reserves remained to defend the cities and castles that constituted the Crusader presence in the Levant. The march began before sunrise, with advance guards probing ahead for signs of Muslim forces. Initially, the route seemed clear, and some commanders began to hope that Saladin had withdrawn rather than risk battle against such a formidable host. But as the sun climbed higher and the July heat became oppressive, Muslim light cavalry began appearing on the flanks, launching hit-and-run attacks that forced the Crusaders to maintain battle formation throughout their advance. The constant harassment slowed progress to a crawl, while the weight of armor and weapons became increasingly burdensome under the merciless Middle Eastern sun. By midday, it had become clear that the army would not reach Tiberias before nightfall. Worse, the route passed through increasingly arid terrain, where water sources were few and easily controlled by enemy forces. The springs at Turan, which should have provided relief for men and horses, had been poisoned or blocked by Muslim engineers. As afternoon wore on, thirst began to take a greater toll than enemy arrows. Horses stumbled and collapsed, forcing knights to continue on foot. Infantry units began to lose cohesion as individual soldiers broke ranks to search for water. The decision to halt for the night near the village of Hattin sealed the army's fate. The position offered no water and little defensive advantage, but continuing the march in darkness would have invited complete disaster. As the Christians made camp on the barren plateau, Saladin's forces surrounded them completely, cutting off any possibility of retreat to Sephoria or advanced to Tiberias. Throughout the night, Muslim engineers hauled up bundles of dry grass and thorn bushes, creating barriers that would channel any Christian breakout attempt into predetermined killing zones. Dawn on July 4th revealed the full extent of the trap. The Crusader army found itself surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces positioned on higher ground. Worse, the Muslims had set fire to the grass barriers during the night, and smoke from these fires, driven by a wind toward the Christian positions, made breathing difficult and coordination nearly impossible. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical discomfort. The smoke seemed to symbolize the fires of hell, suggesting that God himself had abandoned the Christian cause. The battle that followed destroyed not merely an army, but an entire political system. The Crusader heavy cavalry, weakened by thirst and blinded by smoke, could not execute the coordinated charges that had won so many previous victories. Individual acts of heroism proved meaningless against the systematic destruction that Saladin's tactics inflicted. The infantry, abandoned by knights who could no longer protect them, broke and fled, only to be cut down by Muslim cavalry that had been positioned precisely to intercept such attempts. King Guy's desperate attempt to break through to the springs of Hattin failed when his exhausted horses could not maintain the charge necessary to pierce enemy lines. The royal standard fell, was raised again, and fell once more as the knights around it were systematically eliminated. By noon, organized resistance had collapsed entirely. The survivors found themselves prisoners of an enemy who had achieved victory through superior strategy rather than mere force of numbers. The capture of the True Cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusader states, symbolized the completeness of the disaster. This fragment of wood, believed to be from the cross on which Christ was crucified, had accompanied Crusader armies into battle for nearly a century, serving as both spiritual inspiration and political symbol of Christian presence in the Holy Land. Its loss suggested that God had withdrawn his protection from the Frankish settlers, leaving them defenseless against righteous Muslim anger. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed the careful calculation behind his apparent magnanimity. Common soldiers and poor knights were sold into slavery, providing immediate profit and removing potential resistance fighters from circulation. Wealthy nobles were held for ransom, their freedom contingent on payments that would drain Crusader treasuries and prevent the financing of future military efforts. The military orders, whose members had taken vows that prevented them from being ransomed, were executed en masse as dangerous enemies who could never be safely released. King Guy himself presented a special problem. Islamic law prohibited the execution of rulers who had been offered food and drink after capture, and Saladin carefully observed this prohibition by personally offering the king water. But Guy's continued existence as a legitimate Christian ruler could provide a rallying point for future resistance. So Saladin kept him in honorable captivity while methodically destroying the kingdom he claimed to rule. The systematic reduction of Crusader fortifications began immediately after Hattendot's cities and castles that had seemed impregnable when defended by adequate garrisons found themselves untenable when no relief forces existed to break sieges. Acre, the kingdom's principal port, surrendered after a brief siege when its defenders realized that no help would come. Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon, and dozens of smaller strongholds followed suit as Saladin's forces swept through territories that had been Christian for nearly a century. The psychological impact of these surrenders proved as important as their strategic value. Muslim populations that had lived under Crusader rule for generations rose in support of Saladin's forces, providing intelligence about Christian defenses and ensuring that isolated garrisons faced hostile populations as well as besieging armies. Christian populations, particularly the indigenous communities that had predated the Crusades, found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties, but generally chose accommodation with the likely victor over futile resistance. Jerusalem itself, the symbolic heart of the Crusader enterprise, presented Saladin with his greatest opportunity for demonstrating the righteousness of his cause. The city that had been taken by the First Crusade through a massacre that shocked even medieval sensibilities would now be reclaimed through the mercy and justice that Islamic law demanded. The siege began in September 1187, with Saladin's forces positioned to prevent any relief from the few remaining Christian strongholds. The defense of Jerusalem was organized by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few great nobles to escape capture at Hattin. Balian understood that military resistance was hopeless, but he also recognized that the manner of the city's surrender would determine the fate of its population. His negotiations with Saladin established terms that would become a model for the conquest of Christian territories: safe passage for those who could pay ransom, protection for religious sites and non-combatants, and guarantees against the kind of massacre that had accompanied the Crusader conquest. The peaceful surrender of Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, marked the effective end of the first phase of Crusader settlement in the Holy Land. The contrast with the bloody capture of 1099 was deliberate and pointed, where Christian conquerors had violated their own moral principles through indiscriminate slaughter. Muslim reconquest proceeded according to religious law and ethical standards that enhanced rather than diminished Saladin's reputation. The news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderbolt, shattering assumptions about the permanent nature of Crusader achievements and forcing a fundamental reassessment of Christian strategy in the East. The loss of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's burial and resurrection, seemed to demand immediate and massive response. Yet the very scale of the disaster made effective response extraordinarily difficult. The infrastructure of the Crusader states had been so thoroughly destroyed that any new expedition would essentially have to conquer the Holy Land anew. Pope Gregory VIII's bull Audita Tremendi, issued in response to news of Hattin and Jerusalem's fall, called for a new crusade that would dwarf all previous expeditions. The spiritual rewards offered to participants exceeded even those promised by Urban II at Claremont: complete remission of sins, protection of property during absence, and immunity from legal prosecution. But spiritual incentives, however generous, could not solve the practical problems that any new crusade would face. The political landscape of Europe in 1187 seemed almost designed to frustrate crusading efforts. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed by conflicts between Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and his rebellious vassals. France and England remained locked in their ancestral rivalry, with Philip Augustus and Henry II more concerned about their mutual border than distant Jerusalem. The papacy itself was weakened by ongoing disputes with temporal rulers over investiture and taxation rights. Yet gradually, the magnitude of the crisis forced European rulers to set aside their immediate concerns in favour of the larger Christian cause. Frederick Barbarossa, despite his advanced age, took the cross and began organising what would become the largest German expedition ever sent to the Holy Land. Philip Augustus and Henry II, meeting at Gisors in early 1188, agreed to suspend their conflicts and lead a joint Franco-English expedition. Most romantically, Henry's son Richard, heir to the English throne and Duke of Aquitaine, embraced the crusading ideal with an enthusiasm that would make him legendary. The Third Crusade, as this expedition came to be known, would be remembered as the most romantic and dramatic of all the holy wars. The personalities involved seemed drawn from the pages of epic literature. Richard the Lionheart, whose military genius and personal charisma made him the embodiment of knightly virtue. Philip Augustus, whose political cunning and administrative skill represented the new royal professionalism. Frederick Barbarossa, whose long career had made him the most respected ruler in Europe. And opposing them all, Saladin himself, whose combination of military ability, political wisdom, and personal honour won the grudging respect even of his enemies. But romance should not obscure the fundamental challenges that faced the new crusade. The logistical problems of moving large armies across thousands of miles of hostile or neutral territory remained as daunting as ever. The financial costs of equipping and maintaining expeditionary forces for years of campaigning exceeded the resources of even the wealthiest kingdoms. Most critically, the strategic situation in the Holy Land had changed fundamentally since the First Crusade, where the original expeditions had faced a politically fragmented Muslim world. The Third Crusade confronted a unified Islamic empire under competent leadership. The German expedition, departing first in May 1189, initially seemed to vindicate optimistic predictions about crusading success. Frederick's army, numbering perhaps 15,000 men, represented the largest and best organised force the empire had ever sent eastward. The emperor's careful preparations, including detailed negotiations with Byzantine and Hungarian authorities for safe passage, suggested that the disasters which had befallen previous expeditions could be avoided through proper planning. The march through Hungary and the Balkans proceeded smoothly, with local populations generally cooperative and supplies readily available through advance arrangements. Even the traditionally difficult passage through Byzantine territory was accomplished without serious incident, though relations with Emperor Isaac Angelus remained tense throughout. Frederick's diplomatic skill, honed through decades of dealing with recalcitrant vassals and rival rulers, proved invaluable in navigating the complex political situations that arose at every border crossing. The entry into Asia Minor marked the beginning of serious military operations. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, while nominally subject to Saladin's authority, maintained effective independence under Sultan Khailij Arslan II. The Sultan's strategy was to avoid pitched battles while harassing the Crusader army through constant skirmishing, hoping to weaken the expedition through attrition rather than risk his forces in decisive engagements. This approach initially proved effective. The German army, strung out along the narrow roads that crossed the Anatolian plateau, found itself under constant attack from Turkish horse archers who could strike quickly and withdraw before the heavy cavalry could respond. Water sources were poisoned or blocked, forcing long detours that exhausted men and animals. Supplies became increasingly difficult to obtain as local populations fled or were evacuated by Turkish authorities. The Battle of Iconium in May 1190 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the German expedition. Frederick's tactical skill enabled his forces to storm the Seljuk capital and scatter the Sultan's army, proving that Crusader military methods remained effective when properly applied. But the victory also revealed the costs of campaigning in hostile territory. The army had been reduced by perhaps a third through casualties, disease, and desertion, while the remaining forces were increasingly difficult to supply and control. It was in this context that disaster struck. On June 10th, 1190, while crossing the Salaf River in Cilicia, Emperor Frederick drowned in circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Whether he suffered a heart attack while swimming, was swept away by the current while attempting to ford the stream, or met his end through some other misfortune, his death effectively ended the German crusade. The army, deprived of the leadership that had held it together through months of hardship, began to disintegrate almost immediately. Some contingents, led by Frederick's son, Duke Frederick of Swabia, continued toward the Holy Land, and eventually reached Acre, where they joined the ongoing siege. But the great German expedition that had seemed capable of reconquering the entire Holy Land had been reduced to a few thousand survivors, whose arrival barely affected the strategic balance. The death of Barbarossa demonstrated once again how dependent medieval expeditions were on individual leadership, and how quickly the most carefully planned campaigns could collapse when key figures were removed. The Anglo-French expedition, departing in 1190, took a different route that avoided some of the hazards that had destroyed the German force. Philip Augustus and Richard sailed from their respective ports, planning to rendezvous in Sicily before continuing to the Holy Land. This maritime approach offered advantages in terms of speed and supply, but it also created new problems related to naval logistics and the politics of the Mediterranean powers. The winter spent in Sicily, 1190-1191, revealed both the potential for cooperation and the sources of tension that would eventually destroy the Anglo-French alliance. Richard's conquest of Messina, undertaken to protect Crusader supplies from local interference, demonstrated his military capabilities, but also his tendency toward unilateral action that ignored the interests of allies. Philip's negotiations with Tancred of Sicily, aimed at securing naval support for the expedition, showed his diplomatic skill, but also his willingness to pursue French interests at the expense of common crusading goals. The personal relationship between the two kings, complicated by feudal obligations that made Richard technically Philip's vassal for his French territories, grew increasingly strained as the expedition continued. Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre, which took place in Cyprus during the voyage east, was seen by Philip as a deliberate slight to his sister Alice, who had been Richard's betrothed for many years. These personal grievances, while seemingly trivial compared to the great cause that had brought them together, would profoundly affect the conduct of military operations in the Holy Land. Richard's conquest of Cyprus in May 1191, accomplished during a brief stop to rescue ships wrecked in a storm, provided the crusade with an invaluable strategic base. The island's position off the Syrian coast made it an ideal staging area for operations against the mainland, while its agricultural resources could supply expeditionary forces for extended periods. More immediately, the wealth seized from the Byzantine governor Isaac Comnenus helped fund the expensive siege operations that awaited the Crusaders at Acre. The siege of Acre, which had been ongoing since August 1189, had become the focal point of Christian efforts to regain the Holy Land. Guy of Lusignan, released from captivity by Saladin in 1188, had established his claim to continued kingship by initiating this siege with the few forces he could muster. The arrival of European reinforcements had gradually transformed what began as a desperate gesture into a serious military operation, but the city's strong fortifications and Saladin's regular attempts to relieve the garrison had prevented any decisive progress. The siege had evolved into a double blockade, with the Crusaders surrounding Acre, while Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusaders. This complex situation created opportunities for neither side to achieve decisive victory through conventional means. The Christians could not take the city by storm, while the Muslims could not raise the siege without fighting through prepared positions that negated their advantages in mobility and archery. The result was a grinding war of attrition that consumed resources and lives while producing no clear strategic advantage for either side. The arrival of Philip Augustus in April 1191, followed by Richard in June, finally provided the siege with the leadership and resources necessary for success. The two kings brought not only fresh troops, but also the latest developments in siege technology, mangonels and trebuchets capable of battering down the strongest walls, engineers skilled in undermining fortifications, and the financial resources to sustain operations until victory was achieved. The final assault on Acre, launched in July 1191, succeeded through a combination of siege engines, mining operations, and direct assault that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond. The city's surrender on July 12th marked the first major Christian victory since Hattin and provided the crusade with a secure base for future operations. But the terms of surrender, which promised the lives of the garrison in exchange for the return of the true cross and the release of Christian prisoners, would soon become a source of controversy that revealed the growing divergence between Christian and Muslim concepts of honorable warfare. Saladin's inability to fulfill all the conditions of the surrender agreement, whether due to practical difficulties in locating the true cross or deliberate stalling, led to one of the most controversial episodes of the entire crusade. Richard's execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners in August 1191, carried out in full view of Saladin's army, shocked contemporary observers and has continued to generate debate among historians. The massacre demonstrated the Lionheart's ruthless pragmatism when military necessity conflicted with chivalric ideals, but it also eliminated any possibility of future negotiations and ensured that the war would continue with increased bitterness on both sides. The departure of Philip Augustus, shortly after Acre's fall, ostensibly due to illness, but actually motivated by growing friction with Richard and concerns about French domestic affairs, left the English king as the dominant Christian leader in the Holy Land. This development suited Richard's temperament and ambitions perfectly. He could now conduct operations according to his own strategic vision, without the need to accommodate allies whose objectives might differ from his own. The march south from Acre toward Jerusalem in August and September 1191 showcased Richard's tactical genius and his understanding of how to adapt traditional crusader methods to the realities of warfare against Saladin's forces. Instead of the headlong charges that had characterized earlier expeditions, the English king developed a system of coordinated movement that protected his forces from the harassment tactics that had destroyed so many previous armies. The army advanced in carefully organized columns with heavy cavalry in the center, protected by infantry formations on the flanks. Crossbowmen provided covering fire against Muslim horse archers, while supply trains were positioned to minimize their vulnerability to raids. Most innovatively, Richard established a system of rotation that allowed tired units to be relieved without disrupting the overall formation, ensuring that his forces remained fresh and combat-ready throughout the long march. Saladin's response to this methodical advance revealed his own tactical sophistication and his deep understanding of Crusader psychology. Rather than attempting to prevent the Christian advance through pitched battle, where Richard's heavy cavalry might prove decisive, the Sultan sought to provoke the kind of undisciplined charge that had led to disaster at Hattin. Muslim forces conducted constant harassment, appearing suddenly to launch attacks and withdrawing before effective retaliation could be organized. The Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191, represented the culmination of this strategic duel between two of the greatest military minds of the medieval period. Saladin, recognizing that the steady Christian advance could not be stopped through harassment alone, committed his entire army to a pitched battle designed to break Richard's formations through overwhelming pressure. The Muslim forces, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, launched coordinated attacks against the Crusader columns from multiple directions, seeking to force the premature cavalry charge that had destroyed so many previous Christian armies. Richard's response demonstrated why he was considered the finest military tactician of his generation. Despite enormous pressure from his knights, who chafed under the constant missile fire and demanded permission to charge, the English king maintained strict discipline within his formations. The Hospitallers, positioned in the rearguard and bearing the brunt of the Muslim assault, sent repeated messages begging for permission to attack. But Richard continued to wait for the perfect moment when a coordinated charge could achieve maximum effect. The breakthrough came when Saladin's forces, encouraged by their apparent success in pinning down the Christian army, pressed their attacks too closely and lost the mobility that was their primary advantage. At precisely the right moment, Richard unleashed his heavy cavalry in a coordinated charge that shattered the Muslim formations and sent them streaming back across the coastal plain. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since Hattin, a major Muslim army had been decisively defeated in open battle. Yet Arsuf, while a tactical masterpiece, failed to achieve the strategic breakthrough that Richard needed to justify his enormous expenditure of resources and lives. Saladin's army, though defeated, was not destroyed. Within days, Muslim forces were again harassing Christian positions and threatening supply lines. The Sultan had learned that he could not defeat Richard in open battle, but he had also demonstrated that military defeat did not necessarily translate into political collapse when facing an enemy with secure bases and reliable support from the local population. The advance toward Jerusalem, resumed after the victory at Arsuf, soon revealed the fundamental dilemma that faced any Christian attempt to reconquer the Holy Land. The Crusader army could win battles and capture cities, but holding territory required resources and manpower that exceeded anything the European expeditions could provide. Each mile of advance stretched supply lines further and required additional troops for garrison duties, while Saladin's forces remained free to concentrate against whatever target offered the best opportunity for success. By January 1192, Richard's army had advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem, close enough that the towers and walls of the Holy City were visible from the Crusader camps. For many participants, this proximity to their ultimate goal seemed to justify all the hardships and casualties of the previous years. Jerusalem lay before them, apparently defensible only by the same Muslim forces they had already defeated at Arsuf. Yet Richard, with the cool calculation that marked all his military decisions, recognized that capturing the city would be easier than holding it. The logistical analysis was unforgiving. Jerusalem's position in the Judean hills made it difficult to supply from the coastal bases that provided the crusade with reinforcements and equipment. The city's large Muslim and Jewish populations could not be relied upon for support and might actively assist any relief army. Most critically, Saladin retained control of Damascus, Cairo, and the other major Muslim centers, giving him unlimited opportunities to besiege any Christian garrison left in Jerusalem, while the main Crusader army returned to Europe. The decision to withdraw from the approaches to Jerusalem without attempting an assault represented one of the most controversial moments of Richard's entire career. Contemporary chroniclers, writing for audiences that had invested enormous resources in the crusade, struggled to explain how the greatest Christian warrior of the age could abandon the holy city when it seemed within his grasp. Later historians have generally vindicated Richard's strategic judgment, but at the time, the withdrawal appeared to many observers as an inexplicable failure of will at the crucial moment. The negotiations that followed this withdrawal revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval diplomacy. Richard and Saladin, despite their military rivalry, had developed a mutual respect based on their shared understanding of warfare and statecraft. Both recognized that the current situation was unsustainable. The Crusaders could not advance further without risking destruction, while the Muslims could not force a decisive battle without accepting potentially catastrophic losses. The personal diplomacy between the two leaders, conducted largely through Richard's negotiations with Saladin's brother al-Adil, explored possibilities that went far beyond simple military truces. Richard's proposal that his sister Joanna marry al-Adil and rule Jerusalem jointly represented an extraordinarily creative attempt to resolve the fundamental religious conflict through dynastic alliance. Though ultimately rejected due to religious objections on both sides, the proposal demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that both leaders brought to their seemingly intractable conflict. The final phase of the Third Crusade, extending through 1192, consisted of a series of military operations that achieve. As this epic journey through the Crusades ends, centuries of conflict are revealed to have transformed from religious pilgrimages into complex webs of politics, warfare, and cultural exchange that shaped both the Christian and Islamic worlds. The legacies of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin remind us that even amid great division, honour and respect can transcend religious boundaries. Although the Crusades failed in their original goal of permanent Christian control over the Holy Land, they forged lasting connections between East and West that influenced art, science, philosophy, and trade for generations. History's greatest lessons often emerge not from absolute victories or defeats, but from humanity's capacity to learn, adapt, and find meaning in turbulent times.